Hello, my name is Julia. At a family dinner, my own father struck me so hard he dislocated my jaw, while the guests just sat there. I spat blood across the tablecloth, and when I turned to my sister for comfort, she only whispered, "You ruined my night." Then they threw me out into the cold, left bleeding on the porch. But what came after that betrayal was even darker. Would you stay silent if your own family turned you into a spectacle? The air was crisp that early autumn evening in Chicago, the kind that carried the faint smell of burning leaves from neighboring yards. I parked my car at the curb in front of my parents' house, the same two-story colonial where I had grown up, and for a moment, I just sat there with the engine off, staring at the windows glowing warmly against the twilight. Family dinners used to be a comfort, pot roast on Sundays, laughter echoing through the kitchen, but tonight felt different. Tonight, my chest carried a weight, a knowledge that I was walking into something more performative than loving. I stepped out, heels crunching against the sidewalk, and made my way up the path. Through the windows, I caught sight of familiar silhouettes, my sister Ophelie's dramatic gestures, my father Cressida's stiff posture at the head of the table, guests leaning toward them as if drawn by gravity. They always knew how to command attention. And I, the youngest daughter, often felt like an afterthought, a side note in a narrative they wrote without me. When I rang the bell, my mother opened the door with a polite smile, not the embrace one expects after weeks apart. "Julia, you made it," she said softly, as though my attendance was an obligation checked off a list rather than a welcome. Behind her, I heard the murmur of voices, clinking glasses, the cadence of a gathering already well underway. Stepping inside, I adjusted my coat and scanned the room. Guests turned their heads briefly, evaluating me in a glance, weighing me against my sister, who stood radiant under the chandelier light, laughing with one of Father's colleagues. Ian Levanzant's words floated into my mind. Families are supposed to be our safe haven. Often, it's the place we find the deepest heartache. I caught Ophelie's eyes across the room. She smiled at the guest beside her, not at me, and I knew my role was already being scripted. She was the golden child, the flawless hostess. I was the inconvenient reminder that not all daughters shine. Dinner was called shortly after, and we moved toward the long mahogany table. That was when I noticed it. My name card placed at the very far end, near the swinging kitchen door. My chest tightened. Seating charts in families are rarely accidental. Father sat in his commanding position at the head, Ophelie to his right beside the guests of honor. I was almost exiled to the shadows, where the scent of dishwater and food scraps would drift out each time the door swung open. I paused, staring at the card, before pulling out the chair. A seat at the end was not just about location, it was about worth. That thought pressed into my mind as I settled in. Guests glanced my way, subtle but unmistakable, as though they too recognized the symbolism. I lifted my chin, determined not to let them see discomfort. Ophelie glanced down the length of the table and raised her eyebrows in a smirk. "Glad you could join us, Julia," she said, voice sweet but lined with something sharp. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, steadying my tone. My worth wasn't determined by where I sat, but tonight, under the weight of so many watching eyes, it felt like it was. Conversation rolled on as dishes were passed around. Father recounted stories of his business, guests laughed politely, and Ophelie charmed with anecdotes about her latest project. I contributed sparingly, unwilling to compete for air. Instead, I observed the way guests leaned toward her, but not me, the way even my mother filled Ophelie's glass before remembering mine. When it came time for a toast, Father rose, lifting his glass. One by one, others followed, the polished crystal reflecting the chandelier above. I reached for mine and froze. In front of me sat not the delicate wine glass everyone else held, but a plain tumbler, the kind reserved for children or water. A ripple of laughter surfaced from one end of the table. "Guess they ran out of the fancy ones," a guest murmured, enough for me to hear. Heat rushed to my cheeks, but I forced a smile, lifting the glass with poise. Sometimes dignity means swallowing the insult, not the wine. The liquid tasted flat, watered down, but I sipped anyway, holding their eyes. Father clinked glasses with the guest of honor, ignoring mine altogether. My silence was intentional, not weakness. I catalogued the moment carefully, another cut among many, a reminder that humiliation rarely arrives as a single blow, but as 1,000 small pricks. As laughter resumed, I let my mind drift. I thought of my own life, the independence I had carved out piece by piece. I had bought my condo without anyone's help, managed a career in marketing where my work spoke louder than any family narrative. Yet at this table, none of it mattered. Here, I was forever cast in the role of the lesser daughter. I reminded myself of a saying my father used to dismiss: respect is earned, not demanded. He demanded obedience, demanded compliance, but he had never truly earned the reverence he believed was his by right. I swirled the water in my plain glass, watching the bubbles cling to the sides. My resolve hardened. Tonight I chose silence, not because I was powerless, but because I understood timing. I would not erupt when they expected me to falter. My patience was my shield. I looked down the table once more. Ophalie glowed under the chandelier, father's laughter booming beside her. Guests nodded along, oblivious or complicit, I couldn't tell. But I knew something they didn't, that this fragile harmony was already cracking. I placed the glass firmly on the table, its soft thud drowned beneath the chatter. I sat at the end, but I was watching every move. My mind was already a step ahead, preparing for what might come. And as I sat at the end of the table, clutching a plain glass, I realized I wasn't just at the edge of the room, I was at the edge of a storm. The hum of conversation rolled steadily across the long dining table, the air heavy with the aromas of roasted vegetables, glazed ham, and the faint scent of red wine. From where I sat, half hidden at the far end, it felt as though every word, every laugh, carried a weight aimed in my direction. My family excelled at creating a portrait of harmony for outsiders. To the untrained eye, we looked like a well-bred family gathered in love. To me, the cracks screamed louder than the laughter. My father sat at the head, tall glass raised, the very image of patriarchal pride. Beside him, Ophalie leaned forward, her voice carrying a musical charm that coaxed laughter from the guests like clockwork. Her hand gestures were exaggerated, almost theatrical, the kind that pulled people closer. Every time she spoke, heads turned. Every time I spoke, silence quickly swallowed my words. I picked at the bread on my plate, noticing the sideways glances from across the table. Comments slid through the conversation, coated with politeness but sharp in intent. A woman beside my father remarked, "Some children always know how to take the lead." Her eyes flicked briefly down the table toward me. Another chimed in, "Yes, and some are still figuring it out." The chuckle that followed twisted in my stomach. I told myself, sometimes silence isn't peace. It's the weight of unsaid judgments. My smile was polite, my hands folded neatly in my lap, but my mind catalogued every word. Each coded barb added to the tension that had begun the moment I walked in. As the plates shifted and chatter grew louder, my father turned toward me with a rehearsed smile that made my skin prickle. "Julia," he said, his voice loud enough to capture the whole table. "How is work treating you? Still managing those small accounts?" The room quieted in expectation. My fork paused halfway to my lips. "It's steady," I replied carefully. "We've grown some new partnerships this quarter, and my team is expanding." He nodded, but didn't let it land. "Ah, Ophalie was just telling me about her latest project with the design firm. The scale is impressive. She really has an instinct for leadership." He turned back to the table. "I've always said, she has the drive to take on anything. Julia, well, she's still finding her way, aren't you?" Polite laughter rippled through the guests. My jaw clenched, though my expression remained calm. One man leaned toward his wife and said loudly enough for me to hear, "Well, at least she doesn't live in her parents' basement." Laughter flared again, sharper this time, like salt rubbed into an open wound. I straightened my spine. My heart raced, but my words remained inside. It takes strength to know when speaking up only fuels their fire. Instead of answering, I lifted my water glass and sipped slowly, the plain rim stark against the crystal in every other hand. Respect, I thought, is a two-way street. He demanded mine, but never once considered returning it. Tonight's game was different from being placed at the end of the table. This was ridicule on display, crafted to remind everyone present of where I stood. The laughter quieted as food was served. Conversations drifted again until one guest, emboldened by the tone my father had set, leaned toward me. Her name was Melis, a family friend I had known since childhood but never truly trusted. She placed her fork down and asked with a pointed smile, "So, Julia, when will you finally succeed like your sister?" The table went silent. Even Ophelie lowered her glass, eyes glittering with satisfaction. Every gaze turned to me, waiting for the spectacle, waiting for me to shrink. I felt my palms dampen under the table, my pulse hammering in my throat. The humiliation sat heavy, but I steadied my voice. "Success," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "isn't always about applause. Sometimes it's about peace of mind." A few guests exchanged awkward glances, their forks hovering uncertainly. Someone cleared their throat. Ophelie smirked, tilting her head like a cat who had cornered its prey. My father leaned back in his chair, displeasure written in the taut lines of his face. I kept my tone even, my face calm, though inside the storm gathered. A storm doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it's the still air that warns you. The conversation picked back up, scattered and uneasy. My response hadn't been the outburst they anticipated, nor the collapse they desired. Instead, it had returned the weight to them. I sat quietly as dessert plates were brought out, reflecting on how these moments, so small in isolation, cut deeper when stacked together. They were chisels against the stone of my dignity, each remark carving another line. The anger simmered low in my chest, hot but contained. For the first time, I let myself feel it without shame. Not weakness, not tears. Anger. It was fuel. Across the table, I caught sight of Leora, my boyfriend, sitting quietly among the guests. His eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. He didn't speak, didn't intervene, but his look told me he saw it all. That was enough to anchor me. Eleanor Roosevelt's words came to mind. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I repeated them in my mind like a shield. They would not have my consent tonight. So I stayed silent, my patience stretched but intact, even as my father's laughter returned, even as Ophelie leaned into another story that painted her as flawless. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And in that moment, with their laughter still ringing in my ears, I knew the night wasn't finished stripping me down. After the pointed question about my supposed lack of success, the table slowly regained its rhythm. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked again, and laughter rose in pockets around me, but none of it sounded real anymore. The voices felt muffled, like I was submerged under water while everyone else carried on above the surface. My lips moved to mimic a smile at intervals, but inside I had drifted somewhere far away, into a space where their chatter could not reach. I sat back slightly, letting the performance of family life continue in front of me. It was a scene I had witnessed countless times, my father basking in attention, my sister carrying herself like a celebrated figure, guests offering nods and affirmations as though we were actors on a stage. Yet my silence was not emptiness. It was filled with memories, patterns, echoes of something older and more painful than tonight's mockery. It's funny how the loudest rooms can remind you of the quietest hurts. As the laughter rolled around me, I slipped into a memory of a night long ago when I still believed in promises. I was 10 years old, small for my age, sitting on the porch steps with my backpack discarded beside me. That day at school, a group of kids had cornered me, mocking my secondhand shoes and the way I tucked my hair behind my ears when nervous. Their words clung to me like burrs, and I came home with eyes red from tears I didn't want my mother to see. The porch smelled of cut grass and old wood. I hugged my knees to my chest when the front door opened and my father stepped out. He lowered himself beside me with surprising gentleness, the boards creaking under his weight. "You're the baby of the family," he said, resting an arm across my shoulders. "I'll always protect you." I believed him. Those words became more than comfort. They became a pillar inside me, the anchor that steadied me whenever fear crept in. I held on to them through adolescence, through every doubt, through the years of watching him praise Ophelie's achievements while giving me faint nods of approval. I thought he might be hard, but he will always protect me. Now, seated at this long table, listening to the false laughter of guests and the pointed jokes at my expense, that memory burned inside me like a cruel joke. The man who once shielded me with his promise now exposed me to ridicule as if it were sport. A man is only as good as his word, they say. Tonight, that word lay shattered. I stared at him across the table, watching his chest puff slightly with pride as he entertained. The warmth I once associated with his presence had transformed into something jagged, cutting each time he opened his mouth. Promises shape the way we trust. They build bridges between people, bridges we dare to cross because we believe they will hold. But when they collapse, it is not only the bridge that breaks, it is the ground beneath your feet. His vow of protection had been that ground, and tonight I realized I was standing on nothing but thin air. I thought of how much of my resilience had been built on that vow. I had told myself that no matter how dismissive he might seem at times, deep down he was my shield. That shield had rusted away without me noticing, and tonight he wielded it like a sword against me. I looked at him again, his features firm, his jaw set in authority. The cruel irony was not lost on me. What happens when your shield becomes the sword? The question echoed in my mind, twisting tighter the longer I held his gaze. The laughter of another guest jolted me back. My father was chuckling at a story, glass raised high. My sister leaned into the glow of attention, her smile crafted, perfect as ever. For them, nothing had happened. The show carried on. I sat straighter, blinking away the memory. My eyes stayed dry. My body language remained composed, every movement deliberate. I would not grant them the satisfaction of seeing me wounded. My silence wasn't retreat, it was recognition. Maya Angelou's words came to me, clear as if whispered into my ear. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Tonight, my father showed me not just who he was, but who he had always been. His promise had never been about me. It had been about control, about power, about shaping me into what he wanted. Protecting me was only valuable if it made him look noble. I folded my napkin carefully, pressing down the creases to keep my hands steady. I wasn't shaking because I had no more illusions to lose. What broke inside me wasn't hope. It was the myth of him. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened, a gesture hidden under the hum of dinner, but monumental to me. My childhood faith in him died quietly in that moment, replaced by something sharper. Clarity. And in the glow of the chandelier, I finally saw him, not as my father, but as the man who broke his promise. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation had just begun to settle back into a rhythm after my silent revelation, when my father's voice rose above the noise. It wasn't the tone of casual chatter. It had an edge, sharp and commanding, the same voice he used when addressing his employees. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" he announced, tapping his fork against his wine glass. Heads turned, and forks paused mid-air. The room shifted in an instant. What had been a dinner wrapped in false harmony became something colder, structured, almost like a meeting called to order. My shoulders tightened. It wasn't dinner anymore. It was a stage, and I was the unwilling act. I noticed guests leaning in, curious smiles tugging at their lips as if they anticipated drama. They weren't wrong. My father's hand slipped beneath the tablecloth, and when it emerged, he carried a folded set of papers, thick enough to be official, deliberate enough to make my pulse rise. He smoothed the edges as though unveiling something precious, then placed it at the center of the table with a flourish. "This," he began, his voice calm but carrying weight, "is a family agreement. Something for the future, something that requires unity." His gaze swept the table before landing squarely on me. "And Julia will show us just that." The words fell heavy in the room. Unity wasn't what he wanted. Obedience was. I leaned slightly forward, staring at the document while trying to keep my face neutral. Guests exchanged subtle glances, curiosity sharpening into interest. He unfolded the pages slowly, deliberately, the crackle of paper echoing like thunder in my ears. "A new investment property. High potential. All it requires is commitment. Julia, you'll stand as guarantor. His smile was practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes. The blood drained from my face as I scanned the papers. I didn't need to read every line to know what they meant. The loan was steep, the liability enormous. Signing would tie my financial security to their gamble. My condo, my savings, the future I had fought so hard to protect. It would all be at risk. In America, we learn contracts mean business, I thought. But here, it was shackles dressed as paperwork. The guests watched in silence. I could feel their eyes pressing against me, waiting to see if I would comply, if I would fold into the role of dutiful daughter. Ophelie sipped her wine casually, not meeting my eyes, her smirk hidden behind the rim of her glass. She knew. She had known this was coming. I steadied my voice. I don't sign anything without reviewing it privately. My words were calm, deliberate, edged with restraint. Father's face tightened. Julia, don't be dramatic. It's just family business. Family business, I repeated, forcing a thin smile. That seems to be a phrase that excuses a lot. His jaw clenched. Your sister sacrifices everything for this family. Why can't you? His tone cut like a blade, designed not just to pressure, but to shame. Murmurs spread among the guests. Some nodded in approval, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I felt the sting of his words, the familiar comparison, the public framing of me as selfish. Yet I kept my posture straight, my hands steady. Respect doesn't mean blind obedience, I answered, my voice firmer now. I worked too hard for my independence to gamble it away on a contract I didn't choose. His face reddened, fury sparking in his eyes. He slammed his palm flat against the table, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. Glasses rattled, silverware jumped. If you don't sign, he thundered, you're not part of this family. Gasps erupted from the guests. One woman dropped her fork, another whispered to her husband. My mother lowered her gaze, avoiding mine. Ophelie leaned back in her chair, satisfaction dancing in her eyes as though she had been waiting for this declaration. The sting of his words pierced deeper than any threat about money. He wasn't just asking for a signature. He was cutting the cord that tethered me to this family. I swallowed hard, but no tears came. Not here, not now. That was the moment I realized blood ties can be as conditional as any contract. I straightened my back, my jaw still tight with pain from earlier humiliation, and looked directly into his eyes. My silence felt louder than shouting, filling the room with unease that no one dared break. I didn't pick up the pen that night, but I knew he had just written the first line of war. His words echoed in my ears long after they left his mouth. If you don't sign, you're not part of this family. The sound of it pressed into me heavier than the slam of his hand against the table. Around us, the room grew unnaturally still. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, but quickly looked away, some lowering their eyes to their plates as if pretending they hadn't heard. The weight of their silence pressed harder than any outburst. I realized my hands were trembling beneath the table. I clenched them together, forcing stillness, a small act of control in a moment that threatened to swallow me whole. The air was thick, brittle, as if even the walls waited to hear what would come next. An old saying came to me like a whisper. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. I turned instinctively toward the one person who should have spoken, the one whose love I had never doubted. Not fully. Not until now. My mother sat across from me, shoulders bent slightly, her napkin twisted between her fingers. I waited for her eyes to meet mine, for her voice to rise against his ultimatum, to soften the blow with even a single word of defense. But her gaze fell to her plate, her hands fiddling with the linen as though the threads demanded all her attention. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at him. She looked at nothing. A mother's silence can be louder than a father's shout. I felt it pierce deeper than the threat itself. She could have lifted me with one word. She could have stopped the bleeding before it began. Instead, she folded into the quiet, joining the chorus of complicit stares. Guests noticed, of course. I saw the flickers of recognition, the whispers behind wine glasses, the sidelong glances of those who understood the cruelty in her refusal to act. Yet no one challenged it. The sting in my throat wasn't from tears, but from betrayal. My father had always wielded power like a hammer. His aggression was nothing new. But my mother's choice to hide, to let me stand alone, cut with a sharper edge. I lifted my water glass, forcing the motion to seem calm, though my heart pounded against my ribs. The rim touched my lips, but I didn't drink. I needed the silence to taste the truth I was learning, that love could be conditional, that silence could destroy as surely as violence. As I set the glass down, my eyes drifted to Ophelie. She sat composed, shoulders back, her face arranged in that perfect mask she had mastered long ago. And then, as laughter from the far end of the table rose again, someone changing the subject, pretending nothing had been said. Her lips curved. That smile. To the guests, it was reassurance, a cue to continue enjoying their evening. To me, it was a blade polished for display. Her smile wasn't kindness. It wasn't ignorance. It was weaponry. "Everything's fine," her expression said to them. "Oh, don't look at her. Look at me." They obeyed. Laughter built again, fragile but enough to drown me out. One guest leaned closer to Ophelie, drawn by the magnet of her charm, while I sat marooned at the end of the table. The realization landed heavy. She wasn't neutral. She wasn't caught in the middle. She was complicit, thriving in the glow of my humiliation. That fake smile confirmed what I had always resisted admitting. I stood completely alone. Her weapon cut deeper than words. It erased me without sound, turning me into the family's shadow, a necessary prop to contrast her brilliance. I felt bitterness rise, coating every thought, but beneath it was clarity sharper than I had ever known. Family dinners were supposed to be moments of bonding, where we gathered to share meals and memories. But here, at this table, dinner was a courtroom, and I was always the one on trial. Every dish passed down the line carried judgment with it. Every toast sealed another verdict against me. I wondered fleetingly how many times I had excused this before, how many small slights I had brushed aside, telling myself they would improve, how many smiles I had forced, how many conversations I had steered away from pain, convincing myself love could outweigh cruelty. The words of Martin Luther King Jr. surfaced in my mind. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Tonight, it wasn't my enemies who hurt me, it was my family, and their silence rang louder than any insult. I pressed my palm against my lap, nails digging slightly into my skin to ground myself. I thought, I could accept being unloved. I will never accept being erased. The bitterness hardened into resolve. I wouldn't give them the collapse they were waiting for. I wouldn't let silence smother me too. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed back my chair. The sound of wood scraping against the polished floor sliced through the conversation, dragging every pair of eyes toward me. I didn't speak yet, but the noise was enough to shift the air, enough to remind them I was still present, still unbroken. Ophelie's smile glittered down the table. Father's glare burned. Mother's eyes stayed fixed on her plate. The guests watched, tense, unsure whether to laugh again or to brace themselves. And as my sister's smile glittered across the table, I knew I was done playing along with their performance. The silence after his ultimatum stretched so long it felt like the walls themselves were straining to hold it. My father's words still rang inside me. "If you don't sign, you're not part of this family." I had refused, and in that refusal, I had pulled the thread that unraveled his carefully spun authority. He sat stiffly at the head of the table, wineglass untouched, jaw tightening with every second I refused to bend. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some coughed softly. Others pretended to sip their drinks, though their eyes never left me or him. My skin prickled under the attention, but I kept my chin lifted. It felt like thunder rolling in, low and menacing, though no one dared call it by name. I could see it in his face, the reddening cheeks, the vein pulsing near his temple, the hand curling tighter around the stem of his glass. He had built his entire life on power, on control, and now in front of friends and associates, his authority was being chipped away by the very person he had expected to command most easily. I braced myself. I knew what was coming, even before it happened. In one sudden movement, he rose from his chair, his arm swinging across the table. His hand connected with my cheek in a burst of heat and sound that froze the entire room. The slap rang louder than any word spoken that evening. Gasps broke from the guests, a collective intake of breath. A woman's glass clattered against her plate. A man muttered, "My God," under his breath. The sting burned across my face, sharp and unrelenting. My head had snapped to the side, but I straightened instantly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me crumble. My eyes met his, steady, unblinking, a silent defiance that cut deeper than any cry could have. I tasted copper at the edge of my tongue, but swallowed it back. My silence was not weakness, it was defiance, and yet around us, the room stayed mute. No one rose, no one objected. Their silence was deafening, more violent in its complicity than his hand across my face. They looked into their glasses, at their plates, at anything but me. This was his stage, and they chose to be his audience. He paced slightly behind his chair, breathing heavy, like a man winding himself tighter. I knew the first blow had only whetted his anger. I knew another was coming. "I will not sign," I whispered, the words quiet but cutting. His eyes darkened, the fury spilling over. He lunged forward, his fist striking harder this time, not the warning slap of before, but a violent blow that sent a white flash across my vision. Pain seared down my jaw, something shifting out of place with a sickening slide. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth instantly. Gasps rippled again, sharper, horrified. A fork dropped. A guest covered her mouth with her hand. I felt my jaw hang strangely, the hinge broken, the pain radiating into my ear and down my neck. I spit blood onto the pristine white tablecloth, a spray of red staining its perfect surface. It wasn't just blood, it was truth spilling out where everyone could see it. The image of our perfect family, so carefully polished, lay ruined in that crimson stain. I steadied myself with one hand on the table's edge. My vision swam, the chandelier lights blurring into halos, but I refused to collapse. My body screamed for rest, for retreat, but I anchored myself with stubborn pride. Around me, guests shifted again, eyes darting to each other, lips pressed tight in discomfort. One man muttered, "This is a family matter," his voice hushed, but carrying enough for me to hear. The phrase seared itself into me, family matter. That excuse has shielded 1,000 wounds in American homes. I straightened slowly, blood dripping at the corner of my mouth, my other hand pressing against the throbbing side of my face. My breath came shallow, but my resolve deepened. Strength came in silence, and I would not give them spectacle beyond what they had already forced from me. I looked across the table to my sister, praying for something, anything, a glance of solidarity, a flicker of guilt. But instead, her lips curved upward, calm, composed, almost pleased. She looked directly at me and smiled. That smile told me everything. Father settled back into his chair as if nothing had happened. He lifted his glass finally, sipping his wine while guests fumbled with their silverware, unsure whether to rise and leave or to applaud his authority. The room carried on with forced murmurs, but the air was poisoned with what they had witnessed. And as I spat blood onto the tablecloth, I realized I was no longer his daughter. I was his spectacle. The silence in the dining room was no longer silence. It was a suffocating weight pressing into every corner, every breath. My blood had begun to drip steadily from the corner of my mouth, the warmth sliding down my chin, before it fell onto the pristine white tablecloth. The sight was shocking even to me, the red bloom spreading across the fabric like spilled ink. I could hear the faint sound of it dripping, mingling with the muted clatter of silverware hastily set down by nervous hands. Some guests stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others turned away quickly, hiding behind wine glasses, pretending to be caught in casual conversation. But there was no masking what had just happened. My blood, bright and undeniable, was the one thing in the room that refused to be ignored. The smell of roasted meat and aged wine now mixed with the iron tang of blood, turning the air heavy and strange. I gripped the edge of the table with one hand, the wood digging into my palm as I forced myself upright. My legs trembled, but I would not fall. My father's perfect image of family unity lay ruined in front of his guests, stained with evidence of his violence. The family wanted spotless perfection, I thought bitterly. My blood told the truth they tried to hide. I turned my head slowly, looking for something, anything, from my sister. Even in pain, even knowing what had already been done, I still clung to the thin thread of hope that she might show care, that she might remember the years we had shared, the secrets whispered in childhood, the games we played on the lawn, the way she once stood between me and the bullies at school. But Ophelie's eyes met mine with no softness. Her lips parted, and in a sharp, cutting voice she said, "You ruined my night." The words sliced through me deeper than the blow. A few guests gasped softly. Some leaned closer to each other to whisper, but none dared challenge her cruelty. I sat stunned, not because I didn't expect betrayal, but because of the sheer coldness with which she delivered it. My mind reeled back to the child I once was, sitting on the porch beside her, sharing candy and stories, believing that bond was unbreakable. And now, here she was, my sister, the one person who could have bridged the chasm, choosing to widen it with a single sentence. It wasn't the blow that shattered me, I told myself. It was the indifference of the one who shared my childhood. Elie Wiesel's words came unbidden to my mind. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And that was what I saw in her. Not rage, not even rivalry. Indifference. As if my suffering were a mere inconvenience, an interruption to her carefully polished image. This moment cut deeper than my father's hand ever could. His violence was brutal, but hers was dismissive, as though I were nothing at all. That indifference was the true betrayal. Around us, the guests continued their performance. Some lifted their glasses and sipped, eyes fixed on the dark liquid as though it might shield them from the scene before them. Others shifted in their chairs, glancing at their watches, silently praying for an excuse to leave. One muttered under his breath, "Let's not get involved. It's a family matter." The words made my stomach twist. I stared down at the spreading stain on the cloth, red against white, glaring proof of everything they wanted hidden. To them, it was a mess to be ignored. To me, it was the only honest thing in the room. If silence is consent, I thought, then tonight, every guest became a co-signer of my pain. But not everyone turned away. Across the table, I caught the gaze of Valora, one of the quieter guests. Her eyes didn't flinch, didn't dart away. She saw me, truly saw me, and for the briefest moment, her gaze was steady, unblinking. A flicker of recognition passed between us. It was enough to remind me I wasn't invisible, not entirely. Still, I knew what I had lost tonight. Family had abandoned me not with fists, but with silence, with smiles, with indifference. Despite the pounding pain in my jaw, despite the blur in my vision, I lifted my chin. I forced my body to straighten. The room expected collapse. They were waiting for it, but I would not give them the gift of my breakdown. My silence was my rebellion, and in that silence, I felt stronger than in any scream. I refused to give them the gift of my collapse, I whispered inside myself. This humiliation will not be the final word. The scene shifted within me from pain to clarity. I had nothing left to lose. My blood was already on the table, my dignity already stripped bare. What remained was resolve. I took a step back from the table, blood still staining the corner of my lips. The scrape of my chair echoed, drawing their attention once more. My sister smirked faintly, my father looked triumphant, and the guests remained frozen in their indecision. And as my sister's words echoed in my skull, I realized, tonight wasn't about losing my place in the family. It was about losing the illusion I ever had one. I stood in silence, blood drying sticky against my jaw, when my father's hand waved sharply toward the door. He didn't need words, the gesture was enough. His eyes told me everything. Leave, disappear, you no longer belong here. My body ached from the blows, but the deeper ache was his dismissal. The atmosphere grew unbearable. Chairs creaked as guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out in little clusters. Some pressed their lips against wine glasses, pretending to drink. Others looked down at their plates as though the roast on their china suddenly required close inspection. They all knew what was happening. None would stop it. It wasn't enough that he struck me, I thought, tasting iron at the back of my throat. Now he wanted to erase me from the room itself. I scanned the table, waiting for someone, anyone, to object. My mother's head stayed bent, her eyes fixed on the napkin she twisted endlessly. My sister's face was composed, lips set in that faint curve of victory. Around them, our guests shrank into silence, desperate to remain uninvolved. Not one voice rose to defend me. My body trembled, but my mind sharpened. This was no longer just a dinner. It was an exile, and I was its chosen sacrifice. I staggered slightly as I moved toward the doorway. Every step jarred my dislocated jaw, the pain radiating up toward my ear, but I kept moving, clutching the frame for balance. For the briefest moment, I turned back. My eyes locked on Ophelie, silently pleading, reaching for the girl she once was, the sister who had chased away bullies, the one who once promised we'd always be on the same side. She recoiled almost imperceptibly, pulling her chair back, clutching her dress close to her body as though contact with my blood might stain her perfection. The rejection was sharper than any blow. That was the last time I reached for her, I told myself bitterly. And she chose fabric over flesh, image over blood. I took another step toward the door. Behind me, the scrape of utensils resumed faintly, the deliberate noises of people determined to erase the scene unfolding. Their silence shouted louder than words. It was the kind of silence that reinforces walls, the kind that makes isolation complete. The cool wind hit my face as I opened the door. The night was sharp, smelling of wet leaves and faint chimney smoke from neighboring houses. I hesitated on the threshold, the warmth of the house at my back, but before I could even glance around, the door slammed hard behind me. The sound reverberated like a gavel striking wood, final, absolute, unforgiving. My sister's hand had done it, I knew without looking. She had sealed the act. The door wasn't just shut on me, I thought. It was shut on the illusion that I belonged. I stood on the porch, blood dripping down onto my blouse, the cold air biting at the damp fabric. Behind me, through the windows, muffled laughter resumed. My father's booming voice, my sister's practiced laugh, glasses clinking together as though nothing had happened. They hadn't lost an evening. They had cast me out of it. That door became more than wood and hinges. It became the symbol of my expulsion, proof that I had been uninvited not only from dinner, but from the very claim of family. I sank slowly onto the porch steps, pressing my palm against my throbbing jaw. My breath came out in sharp bursts, steaming in the night air. The quiet outside contrasted painfully with the chaos inside. Neighbors' porch lights flickered in the distance, crickets chirped faintly, and a dog barked down the street. The world carried on while I sat discarded on the steps of my own childhood home. In America, they tell us family is everything, I whispered into the dark. But what if your family decides you are nothing? The ache in my chest grew heavier than the pain in my face. It wasn't the blows I remembered most. It was the ease with which they had discarded me. My father's hand had struck me, but his dismissal broke me. My mother's silence stung. My sister's rejection carved deep. Together, they had stripped me of belonging. I steadied my breathing, forcing air in and out, refusing to collapse here in the cold. My heart pounded, but beneath it a new thought stirred. Perhaps survival meant letting go of them entirely. For the first time, I considered that walking away forever might not be loss but liberation. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, staring down the dark street ahead. My face throbbed, but inside, something shifted, spirit hardening, reshaped by betrayal. And as the door slammed behind me, I understood. I was no longer a daughter at their table. I was an exile in my own bloodline. The porch steps were cold beneath me, each board rough against my legs as I lowered myself down. My jaw throbbed with every movement, blood dried stiff against my blouse, a reminder of the humiliation I'd endured minutes earlier. Behind me, muffled through the thick wooden door, came the sound of laughter, of cutlery striking plates, of voices pretending nothing had happened. Inside, they feasted. Outside, I bled. The autumn air carried the smell of wet leaves and chimney smoke from the neighboring houses. The night pressed close, damp and chilly, making me shiver in my thin coat. Yet the cold in my chest was heavier than the air around me. Abandonment sat heavier than pain. I wrapped my arms around myself, rocking slightly forward as if my own embrace might hold me together. I looked down the quiet suburban street. A porch light flickered across the way. A dog barked distantly. Life went on undisturbed, unaware of the exile that had just been carried out. Survival, I realized, would have to come without them. They had chosen to leave me here. I dug into my pocket with trembling fingers and found it. The bracelet Ophelia had given me when we were girls. It was simple, cheap, but to me it had always been a symbol of our bond. I clutched it tightly now, letting the memory wash over me. Two little girls in the backyard, swearing never to let each other face the world alone. The bracelet pressed into my palm, but my grip slipped. Blood from my fingers smeared the beads, and then, snap, it broke. The elastic gave way, and tiny beads scattered across the wooden steps, tumbling into the darkness between the planks and rolling into the damp grass. I froze, staring down at the broken string. My chest tightened. It wasn't just jewelry. It was the last fragile thread of a sisterhood I thought still existed. Watching those beads scatter felt like watching the final pieces of illusions spill away, rolling into places I couldn't reach. I whispered aloud, "That's it then. It's gone." The words fogged in the cool air. The broken bracelet mirrored every broken promise, every betrayal, every hand that had turned against me or refused to reach out. I didn't try to gather the beads. I let them roll into the dark, symbolic of everything I had to let go. The sky grumbled above me, a low growl of thunder. Within minutes, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. Droplets dotted my coat, dampening my hair, soaking into the already stained blouse. I didn't move. I didn't run for cover. The cold rain intensified the ache in my jaw, but I refused to knock on that door again. I refused to beg my way back into a place that had decided I no longer belonged. Sometimes you have to stand in the rain to remember you're still alive, I told myself. The words sounded strange, half defiant, half resigned. The chill seeped into my bones, but it also carried something else, cleansing. My tears, hot and angry, blended with the rain until no one, not even me, could tell where one ended and the other began. Across the street, neighbors' windows glowed with warmth, silhouettes moving casually inside, families gathering around television screens, couples sipping wine, children running through hallways. Their world felt impenetrable to me, my isolation starker against the soft light of their belonging. They didn't just cast me out of a house, I thought, lifting my face to the rain. They cast me out of belonging. Each drop of rain felt like a truth washing over me. I wasn't invisible, not to myself. I could no longer cling to what had never truly been mine. I pushed myself upright, knees trembling but steadying as I rose. My blouse clung to me now, soaked through, hair plastered against my cheeks. I inhaled deeply, the cool, wet air filling my lungs. I lived my life hoping for a seat at their table, I whispered into the night, voice ragged. But it was never mine. Blood is not always thicker than betrayal. Despair loosened its grip, replaced by a bitter clarity that felt almost like freedom. If this was the bottom, then here was my foundation. I remembered J.K. Rowling's words I once kept taped to my desk at work. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. The rain poured harder, but I stood taller. My clarity cut through the storm around me. The only way was forward. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, though the water returned instantly. Still, it was enough to clear my eyes, enough to let me see the street stretching ahead, dark but waiting. I stared into that darkness, leaving behind the broken bracelet and the slammed door, leaving behind the last illusions I'd carried. My body was broken, but my will was sharpening, and as the rain soaked me through, I realized I wasn't abandoned. I was reborn in exile. A week passed, though my body measured it in pain more than days. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and paper gowns as I sat in the examination chair, my jaw bandaged, bruises painted across my face like ugly reminders of what had happened. The dislocation had been adjusted, but every bite of food, every word spoken still carried a dull throb. My body would heal slower than my pride, and even that I wasn't sure could ever mend. At night, when I lay awake in my condo, I replayed everything: the laughter muffled through the door, the slam that shut me out, the bracelet beads scattering into the dark. It wasn't just my jaw that felt fractured, it was my spirit, yet I refused to collapse into despair. I whispered to myself, sometimes healing doesn't mean going back. It means going forward with scars as proof you survived. But I wrestled with a question: do I cut ties forever, disappear into silence, or do I fight back? Silence would keep me safe. But silence would also let them win, and I had already given them too much. Slowly, the decision crystallized. Truth had to surface. One evening, Leora came by, his quiet presence filling the space as I spread the crumpled contract across my kitchen table. He stood behind me, hand steady on my shoulder. "Are you ready to look at it?" he asked softly. I nodded, even as dread coiled inside me. We laid the papers flat, smoothing their edges, and I began to study the details I had been too overwhelmed to notice at dinner. My eyes traced the signature line, and there it was, my name, written in ink, clean and deliberate. But it wasn't my hand. I froze, my breath catching. "That's not me," I whispered. Leora leaned closer, comparing it with my driver's license I'd placed on the table. The forgery was close, but not close enough. "Someone signed this for you," he said grimly, "before you ever saw it." A cold wave washed through me. It wasn't just betrayal of trust. It was fraud in my own name. Anger rose, sharper than any bruise. My father's obsession with control had crossed from emotional tyranny into criminal territory. He had written me into his scheme without my knowledge, expecting my silence to seal it. Fury steadied me where fear might have buckled my knees. This wasn't only about me anymore. It was about what he was willing to do to anyone in his way. I pressed my palm against the forged page, my voice low but clear. Now I have grounds to fight back. The evidence sat between us, heavy and undeniable. And then the phone rang. I hesitated before answering, my voice muffled by the stiffness of my jaw. "Hello? Julia?" The voice was female, tentative. It was Valora, one of the dinner guests. I hadn't expected to hear from her again. "Yes?" There was a pause, then a rush of words. I shouldn't even be calling, but I can't let it sit on my conscience. That night, I recorded part of it, on my phone. The room seemed to tilt. "You recorded?" "Yes. I caught the moment he hit you. And your sister. What she said." Her voice shook slightly. "I know no one else spoke up, but I couldn't stand there and pretend. I have the video if you want it." I gripped the phone tighter, my heart pounding. In a room full of silence, one voice dared to be louder. "Valora, do you realize what this means?" "I do," she said simply. "That's why I'm scared, but you deserve at least one person who didn't turn away." My throat tightened, but not from pain this time. Gratitude and shock mingled, leaving me momentarily speechless. I had braced myself for exile, for isolation, but here was proof, undeniable proof, that I wasn't invisible, and that truth could not be erased. When we hung up, I placed the phone gently on the table beside the forged contract. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from resolve. With the false signature and the recording, I held the keys to everything. I was no longer just a victim replaying pain. I was a strategist holding evidence. That weekend, Leora, Valora, and I sat together in my living room. The blinds were drawn, the folder of documents and the phone between us. The three of us represented something unexpected. Not just survival, but the beginning of resistance. "What will you do with it?" Valora asked, her eyes steady. I looked at both of them, my jaw aching, but my voice firm. "We prepare. Not just for them, for everyone who thinks silence can bury truth." Leora nodded. "It will come at a cost." "I know." I replied. But sunlight is the best disinfectant. If this comes out, it won't just expose them. It will show others they're not alone. I leaned back, my body sore, but my resolve sharpening. I'm not just fighting for me, I'm fighting for every person silenced at their own dinner table. Anticipation coiled in my chest, not fear, but readiness. I placed my hand firmly over the folder, the documents rough against my skin, the phone buzzing faintly as if reminding me it was still there. The next time I faced them, it wouldn't be as their daughter. It would be as their reckoning. I stood before the mirror, fastening the last button on my black suit. The fabric was crisp, the fit precise, and yet what stared back at me was not the child they had dismissed, nor the woman they had silenced. My jaw, still faintly bruised, bore the line of a scar that no powder could hide. I traced it lightly with my finger, then dropped my hand. I wasn't the child they once dismissed, I whispered to my reflection. I was the storm they created. Behind me, Leora lingered in the doorway, his presence steady as ever. You don't have to do this alone, he reminded me, his tone quiet, protective. I turned, holding the folder of evidence against my chest. I do, because silence is what allowed them to believe they owned me. That ends tonight. His eyes softened, but he didn't argue. He only nodded once, trusting me to know my path. I slipped on my coat, squared my shoulders, and left the condo without another word. The night air in Chicago bit at my face, but it felt almost cleansing. The week of recovery was over. Now came confrontation. The driveway was lined with cars when I arrived. Their house, glowing from within, mirrored the same scene as before. Laughter spilling out, the clinking of glasses, the performance of family perfection. I stepped inside, my heels echoing against the hardwood floor. Heads turned instantly. The room stilled, tension crackling through the air. I saw it in their eyes, the recognition, the discomfort. My scar spoke louder than any voice I could raise. I didn't need to say a word. My body carried the evidence they had tried to bury. At the head of the table, my father's glare locked onto me, seething with a mix of fury and fear. My sister smirked faintly, though the edges of it faltered when her eyes caught the scar. I walked with deliberate poise, each step reclaiming space I had once been denied. I did not drift toward the end of the table. I did not shrink into the shadows. I pulled out the chair directly across from him, the scrape echoing like a challenge, and sat. The guests shifted uneasily. No one spoke. The silence was thicker than wine. Reaching into my pocket, I withdrew the broken bracelet, the childhood keepsake I had once clutched for comfort. Its thread was severed, beads scarred, fragile history now fragments in my palm. Slowly, I placed it in the center of the table. This, I said evenly, my voice steady, once meant protection. Now it's proof of how protection was broken. The beads rolled slightly across the wood, clicking against one another, the sound louder than the whispers that rippled through the room. My father's jaw clenched tighter. My mother's face paled. My sister's smirk froze. The gesture shocked the room more than shouting ever could. It reframed the family story without needing explanation. Guests exchanged uneasy looks. Some avoided my gaze, but others seemed to understand immediately. It wasn't jewelry. It was a verdict. I held my voice calm, but my eyes did not waver. They revealed pain, yes, but also strength. Strength born of betrayal, of endurance, of a vow never to be erased again. Then I turned, not to them, but to the guests. My gaze swept the table, forcing each one to meet my eyes. The night you sat here in silence, I bled for all of you to see. Silence doesn't erase violence, it multiplies it. The words hung heavy. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their eyes. I continued, the scar on my jaw throbbing with each syllable. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Justice cannot be for one side alone, but must be for both." That night, you chose a side. Tonight, I bring balance. My father opened his mouth, his voice rising. "Julia, enough of this charade." I raised a hand, palm firm, cutting him off. The power in the gesture stunned even him. "No. You've spoken enough. Now you will listen." The room stayed frozen. For the first time, he sat back, forced into silence. I breathed slowly, each inhale a reclamation of space. Strength, I realized, was not always in fighting back with fists or fury. Sometimes it was in choosing to face your abusers publicly, calmly, without flinching. I will not be erased, I vowed aloud. Not by you, not by silence, not by the lies you have fed this table. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. With deliberate motion, I slid the forged documents and the phone recording onto the table. My hand rested on top, steady, unshaken. My father's face drained of color as his eyes landed on the papers. My sister's smirk crumbled. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. The guests leaned forward, breath held, sensing the reckoning that had arrived. And as I placed the evidence between us, I realized I hadn't come for their approval, I had come for their reckoning. The dining room was frozen in silence as every eye focused on the folder I had placed in the center of the table. Its weight seemed to echo louder than any spoken word. My father shifted in his chair, trying to appear unbothered, though his fingers tapped restlessly against the polished wood. My sister fidgeted with the stem of her wine glass, her smirk breaking at the edges. The guests sat taut, unsure if they were about to witness reconciliation or ruin. Truth has a weight. Tonight, I let them carry it. The scar on my jaw pulsed like a living reminder, throbbing with each heartbeat. I inhaled deeply, choosing words with surgical precision. This moment would define me, not as their daughter, but as my own woman. For too long, they had owned the story. Tonight, I would take it back. With deliberate calm, I opened the folder. I slid out the stack of contracts, their corners sharp against my fingertips. Holding them up, I said in a voice steady and cold, "Check the signature." Gasps rippled through the guests as their eyes darted across the page. Even at a glance, the fraud was clear. The handwriting was a mimic, but the deception shone under scrutiny. My father's jaw tightened, his composure slipping. Before anyone could recover, I reached for the phone Valora had given me. Unlocking it, I tapped play. The room filled with the unmistakable sounds, my father's voice issuing threats, my sister's cutting remark, "You ruined my night," and the sharp crack of hand against flesh, followed by my stifled cry. "Play the tape," I said simply, though the command was already obeyed. The audio swelled through the silence, undeniable, unshakable. Guests who had once laughed along now sat with hands over their mouths, eyes wide in shock. Some muttered disbelief under their breath. Others turned on one another, whispering accusations of complicity. For years, I thought, they owned the story. Tonight, I reclaimed it. My father surged forward, slamming the table so hard the glasses rattled. "This is lies," he shouted. "She's manipulating all of you." But his fury rang hollow against the evidence. No ally came to his defense. The men who once nodded to him in agreement, the women who once praised his charm, all sat silent. Their silence was no longer complicit. It was condemning. Ophelie, pale and shaken, tried to resurrect her social mask. She lifted her chin, lips twitching into a smile, but the gesture collapsed before it could form. The room no longer bought her act. The smirk that once commanded attention now looked desperate, brittle. Guests leaned closer to one another, no longer whispering to protect the family's image, but whispering openly, condemning what they saw and heard. The empire of silence had collapsed under the sound of their own voices. I rose slowly, calm and deliberate, leaving the papers and the phone on the table as though planting final nails in a coffin. My chair scraped back, echoing like a gavel's strike. Their eyes followed me as I stood, and for once I did not feel small. I felt taller than the chandelier, steadier than the floor beneath me. "Family isn't blood," I said, my voice carrying across the stunned room. "Family is who refuses to let you bleed alone." My father stared, speechless for once. My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. My sister looked away, her eyes glistening. I didn't feel pity. I felt clarity. I recalled the words of James A. Garfield. "The truth will set you free. But first, It will make you miserable." They looked miserable now, and I felt freer than I had in years. I walked toward the door, not cast out this time, but leaving on my own terms. Behind me, chairs scraped as guests stood. Some nodded solemnly in respect. Others whispered apologies for their silence. Their acknowledgement didn't erase their failure, but it confirmed I no longer carried shame alone. The night air met me at the threshold, cool and steady. I stepped outside, the scar on my jaw still visible, but my heart unburdened. I no longer needed their approval. I carried my own dignity. And as the door closed behind me, I realized I hadn't lost a family. I had lost a prison. And in that loss, I found myself,